Introduction to Dialectics, 221 actually, and go in about, I think it's about 6 pages. It begins with, these are his Introduction to Dialectics, the general plan, and it begins on 222. Actually, you can see notes, Adorno's notes for the lectures, his actual notes, right? And it begins with the Introduction to Dialectics, general plan. And then if you turn, I think it's about 5 pages, he has a very beautiful section here that I think would give a lot of assistance.
I didn't even look at this stuff.
Anyway, about 5 pages in, it begins dialectic. The top line is reference here to the 2 possible versions of dialectic, the positive, that is the idealistic dialectic, and the critical, materialistic dialectic. And he makes a separation early on in Hegelian fashion. I'll wait till you get there before I go.
What's it say at the top? Reference here.
Yeah,
I got it.
Okay, that's the page I'm looking at. So you can see on the margins here, and I mean, I like this this is how I work too. You try to put something in the margin going down as well as the propositions in here. So you see he makes this distinction, obviously, between the Hegelian positive dialectic, the idealist dialectic, and then the critical, i.e. materialistic dialectic. That's the first level of distinction, right? There's indeed spirit, but not in Marx. You can see in the left side, right? Yeah? Is everybody with that?
No.
I mean, no? Okay. The top of the page, Jonathan, it's not paginated.
I know, but okay.
It's about the 6th or 7th page in from the beginning.
Okay.
It says reference here. Yeah.
Oh, reference here. Okay.
Yes. Right. So this begins, I think, a very, very good general, sense of what Adorno is up to throughout the entire lectures. Okay. So first of all, he makes the distinction between the positive and the critical dialectic, and in the margin on the left side, in Hegel there is indeed spirit, but not so in Marx. Thereby, without mediation, the concept of dialectic itself and its difficulties. So he's going to go through multiple levels of the difficulties for the traditional way we think, traditional modes of thinking. So first of all, he'll begin with the whole and the part. Dialectic, he says, in the middle of the page, presents a series of difficulties. I'm just reading Adorno, for traditional modes of thought. 1, okay? So this is the beginning. Whole and part must constantly be seen in relation to one another. Crucial term there, in relation, right?
Michael?
Yeah?
I mean, I don't understand how is the idealist dialectic is positive and the materialist dialectic is critical. I have made that association.
Well, one, in terms of the positivity of the dialectic in Hegel, which ends up with a positivity of absolute spirit and absolute knowing coming full circle, yields a positivity at the end. Whereas in Marx, you no longer have that kind of positivity.
Right, it's
at the
open.
end. Right,
Yes.
an openness and also no closure, right? No, number 1. And number 2, what Marx does is he takes matter as a starting point rather than spirit in terms of the unfolding of the dialectical process.
Yeah.
Whereas in Hegel, we'll still use the word Geist and not matter, not Sache. Yeah. So I think this, in a very general sense, this is what he's trying to do. I mean, again, he's giving a kind of embryonic thing here. So the negative, because Adorno is the master of what he calls the negative dialectic. So he's sort of building towards that. That's one of the other reasons he's using positive dialectic for Hegel, that it yields ultimately this positivity. And both from Adorno's position, Marx is not teleological, right? The dialectic is not teleological, nor is Marx's thought itself, ultimately teleological, although a whole generation of Marxists thought that, the final moment, and this was where the religiosity kind of came back in, that the proletariat ultimately would be the subject of history, and this would bring the closure, to the through revolutionary processes. So Adorno does not buy this reading of Marx, which he would consider a deterministic model and a teleological model. There's an end point. Yeah. Is that okay? Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, no, maybe when you're finished with this page, I read, I thought it was really important, but I don't think I fully understood his explication of the controversy with Benjamin, which he references in the margin.
We can do a whole course on that.
Yeah, but I felt
I'm trying
like
to do it basically.
I thought it was really
Okay.
important.
Okay, it is, yeah.
In terms of materialist dialectics.
Okay, yes.
From extrapolating from the particular.
Right.
So I really wanted to grasp
Okay,
that.
okay. Let's read it then. Let's see what he has to say in terms of his propositions, and then please feel free, anybody, to intervene. Whole and part must constantly be seen in relation to one another. The part must already be grasped on the basis of a whole that is never entirely given to us. Right? So you're always having this relational model at work. Part and whole and part. And the whole itself, right, is never entirely given to us in terms of perception or in terms of datum, whatever you want to think of this as, right? Never entirely given.
So I was reading it, I was hungering and hoping for an example, and then he says, like, I don't like to give examples, but okay, here's an example. Yeah. And the example that he used was really, really illuminating.
This is my second move
X
today.
Is a human.
This is my second page, 68, 69, 70.
On
why Hegel is against the concept of examples, and then how Adorno gives an example about the human being. And that's the basis of dialectical contradiction. But I'm going to go back to that. I hear you. You anticipated me beautifully.
Because that was really
absolutely
important.
Pages 68 through 70.
And in that example, I kind of thought, maybe
I was going to read through this very carefully, too. This is in lecture 7. But let's do this first.
Sorry.
If you don't mind, no, it's okay. You know exactly where I'm going. Yeah, 2 red stars plus. You can get a yellow star too. We can do that over Edgar Snow versions of stars, right? Anyway, okay, that is precisely, and this is interesting too. He takes on the concept of intuition here. This is precisely what is falsely understood as intuition. So more on concept of intuition, he's going to talk about that later, who knows. But anyway, the whole in turn is not to be conceived as something ever finished. Again, the non-teleological or the non-closure, aspect of the whole, but must be derived, this is interesting, that the whole itself is derived from the movement of the parts than from a higher general concept. And the example that he's going to give on pages 68, 69, and 70 of the human being shows this at work, I think. Okay? So that is, it cannot be derived from theory, the later Lukács, for example, and the abstract concept of ideology. All right. So going down, right, the anti-positivist moment means in real terms the apparently ultimate data are all mediated through society as a whole. Right? That's not really the case. He's referring to Lukács and the relationship to positivism that Lukács has later in his career. So on the right column here in the little smaller print is Adorno's critique of positivism vis-a-vis Lukács. And on the left, for example, matter, interpretation of literature mediated through the totality, his controversy with Benjamin. This is the precise value of theory, which stands in for the whole. So, I mean, I don't know where you want to begin there. I mean, it is complicated, but with Benjamin and Adorno. Adorno does not believe in the totality. I mean, he is not a proponent, if you will, of any kind of final totality. For Adorno, the inversion is of Proposition 20 of Hegel, which I brought because I thought, again, Adorno is also backing up on some of Hegel. The proposition number 20 in the preface, the true is the whole, is Hegel's famous thing, that he's going to invert the true is the false. Right? Okay? So, in some ways, the whole, right, is really what Adorno is doing, and he anticipates, and this is another long discussion, but just to throw it out there, that Adorno is really talking about relationship of the pars totalitas, right? The part and the whole relation. There is never, quote, the true as the whole for him, right? It is really this movement and this relation that is always going on. So, when he says about theory takes the upper hand, if you will, or to work with theory only, I think what he's saying is, instead of the totality, we really are building theory. We're constructing theory instead of constructing totality. Yeah? And that in some ways, his argument with Benjamin was that Benjamin had a tendency in his work on German tragic drama, as well as the thesis on the philosophy of history, to be totalizing. In fact, Benjamin believed in the end, right, in a certain way. There is a teleological conception of the dialectic on the thesis of the philosophy of history, in which that the new messianic time and the messianism really is the classless society, right? And he actually talks about this. And historical materialism is the method that gets us this way. Any commentary? I'm trying my best to kind of work through this. So historical materialism, if you've read, I don't know if anybody read the thesis on the philosophy of history. It's the first one is that historical materialism, he has an imagined puppet show and people dressed in Turkish attire with a hookah and an imaginary chess game in which is programmed automatically to always win. And that's historical materialism. The proletariat will always win. Although it's an unconscious Benjamin, yes. This is the first thesis on the philosophy of history. Right. That historical materialism is always going to win. It's a working premise for him. Yeah. This is his messianic conception, both of time as well as of the class struggle. Now, so this is how he sees things and ultimately as a totality. For Adorno, as opposed to Adorno, who is more involved, even though Benjamin is very much on top of the some of the avant-garde of his time. And the split here, and again, this is another long story. I mean, do courses on this kind of stuff. But Benjamin had sided with Brecht in the argument, right? That somehow Brecht's way of praxis in his theater, the theater of alienation, was a way of overcoming, right? Or a practice in historical materialism. Whereas for Adorno, the artists were really the ones that had a different kind of, fracture, if you will, or a fractured dialectic. Samuel Beckett, in particular. That a Beckett's Waiting for Godot tells us more about our times than Mother Courage, the Threepenny Opera, on Mahagoni, etc. This is where Adorno's coming from. He is choosing a much more, an artist, who is very, broken, if you will, or fractured in a way. And in fact, Adorno called his own dialectic the fractured dialectic. That it never could become whole. Right? He called it an open and fractured dialectic. He uses this description for his, so that always the part will somehow be, greater than the whole.
So does he, or is Kant see an endless struggle, basically?
Endless struggle, yes, yeah. A non-closure, right, in a certain way. But although he would see Benjamin and Brecht in the framework, if you will, of still representational thinking. Because, this needs to be closed, because all they're doing is setting up one aspect or multiple aspects of the dialectic, but primarily the oppositional dialectic. They're only dealing with dialectical contradiction, and that this can be incorporated back into the system. Whereas for Adorno, the relevance of the pars totalitas is that there's always that part that's greater than it can be ultimately systematized or brought back in or internalized to the system. Well, especially, the capitalists. So you're trying to avoid here a kind of doubling, if you will. On the one hand, you have the capitalist master. On the other hand, you have the proletariat, and that this conflict will go on forever. This is the subject-object, or the subject of history in the Lukácsian sense of the universalization of the proletariat, who ultimately will be, in Benjaminian messianic time, the exterminating angel, to use a Buñuel phrase of capitalism, right? This is what they do. Whereas in Adorno's case, no. This will not, the struggle will be an endless struggle. Very much like Althusser in terms of ideology, which is a critique of Lukács's version of ideology, that somehow in the new society, the ideology will go away. Althusser has always said that the ideology even has a tendency maybe even to get stronger. So this is an has no history, right? He uses a play on Freud. The unconscious has no history. For Althusser, ideology has no history. So this is kind of interesting when you begin to try to think of this in terms of, one aspect, if you will, or, one criteria of dialectical thinking, which is oppositional thinking, right? And the organized spirit of the contradictions, which he defines earlier in here. This is not enough, right, for revolutionary thinking or for, radical, practice.
And you think there's any Freud in here?
Well, yes, obviously, but he doesn't mention Freud at all. In Adorno, you mean? Yeah. He doesn't mention him, but yeah, they're very well aware. This school is very well aware.
Because it seems, it's the same as what Freud says about dreams.
Yeah, that's right. The seventh chapter of the interpretation of dreams. Yeah, absolutely. So, but I think the central thing here is to, again, and we'll go back to this example, and I'm really glad you brought it up. I was going to bring it, but I'm glad someone else picked up on this, that the example that he gives, we'll go back to this in relation to this, but I want to go through these five points before we, get a little more into the text that he's doing. So I lost my page. I got it. Okay. All right. So the second is there's therefore no step-by-step procedure. This is number 2. There's no step-by-step procedure as there is in the natural sciences and in traditional practically oriented science. Dialectic attacks the traditional concept of an absolute first. So in a way, that's an attack upon, if you will, Aristotle's version of metaphysics, the search for firsts, and of course even Descartes' first philosophy, again, in the rationalism. Dialectic is not ontology, nor is it positivism. So let's stop there for a second, read in what he's doing in between the lines. So there's no clear and distinct perception. That's a direct attack on Descartes' step-by-step deductive reasoning, and this is from the Discourse on Method. This is part 2 of the Discourse on Method, which is called the rules, 4 rules for the sufficient logic, right? 4 sufficient rules for logic, in which Descartes is taking on the medievalists, logicians, as well as Aristotle, and reduces, logic to 4 basic principles, right? This is Cartesian logic, but for Adorno, historically, this kind of logic is part of the dialectic. Right? It's not as we talk about in materialistic dialectic, but it is part of dialectical thinking and part of its history. Right? And he will speak to this in, I think, lecture 13 and 14. Lecture 12, 13, and 14. He will speak about this vis-a-vis Descartes and the Cartesian method and the rationalist enterprise. Right? And he'll also talk about Leibniz and the monadic, as well as the Cartesian substance, which we'll be doing, somewhat later in Heidegger today. But anyway, okay. So the object, which is intrinsically dynamic and not unambiguous. So Descartes, the first rule is to be clear and distinct in all things. Self-evidence is your first rule. Your second rule is to break down the whole into parts. It's interesting, right? He actually does this and this is the basis for modern rationalist science, right? This method. And so he'll talk about this, as another way of looking at objects in the world to break down into as many parts as possible the object in its wholeness, right? The third rule is to begin for the most simplest to the more complex, right? And within this, there's no longer a natural order of things, but there's an order of reasons. And this is very important for Descartes. And the fourth rule is to be comprehensive, fully enumerative of all things. So he's playing, Adorno, very well aware of this in the history of philosophy, and this is there's no step-by-step procedure, whereas for Descartes, the four sufficient rules of logic are applied in terms of, and he gives the example, speaking of examples, it's very abstract, but in the Discourse on Method, Descartes recounts how he invents analytical geometry by using his method. This method of, this four sufficient rules of logic. So he actually invented, a moment in mathematics. Yeah. Bob Kenter, who was a translator of Adorno, once told me Descartes was the most monstrous mind that ever hit the universe. Monstrous, it's so incomprehensible what was going on in this guy's mind during this period, and this is an Adorno scholar speaking this way. I don't know what he really means by that. We have to continue the discussion. But he says every time I read him, I'm floored. I don't know what, I'm overwhelmed by the genius and all this. But anyway, yeah, this was the advent of modern philosophy. And Adorno is very well aware. It's also the advent of modern science before we get to, 19th century, movements in, 1905, all this, from 20th century, yeah, but the 19th century, you have all the predicates, right, working in some ways, yeah. So there's an attack upon, Hegel is an attack on Descartes in some ways, yeah. So, anyway,
those four principles, that sounds like the closest thing I've heard to what might be called the scientific method.
Yes, that's right. That's what he's still doing here. Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's a step-by-step procedure is not dialectical. Right? That's what he's really saying here.
But it's not the scientific method the way people define it.
No. You mean the Cartesian
method.
It's
scientific,
method?
But it's not the scientific method
in terms of
empiricist model.
No, that's later. No, this is the rational model. This is the scientific rational model. Yeah. So, in the natural science and in traditional practically oriented. Okay, so then he'll say nor ambiguous, right? Unambiguous, especially the dialectic implies discontinuity. So, yeah, I'm under natural sciences, practically oriented, and the dialectic, especially, implies discontinuity. Against breaking down everything into elements, step by step, completeness, simple and complex, right? Right. And then it's not natural reflection, the mobility of thought, being within and being without. Answer, knowing where we want to get to. We want to get to a tendency in thinking. I think that's what Adorno is really talking about, is a tendency here, right? About how do we look at tendencies. Okay. So it's against first, it's against ontology, it's against step-by-step procedure, right? And, it begins with Descartes. Okay, so thirdly, dialectic eludes the simple alternative, the either or. This is another thing, too, the either or, right? And this is obviously a reference to Kierkegaard, which was one of Adorno's first works. Kierkegaard, Construction of an Aesthetic. And if you want to see embryonically, I'm speaking like a professor, like at Yale, but it's kind of, anyway, if you really want to, see Adorno's pars totalitas at work, vis-a-vis Benjamin, you could read on the one side the Construction of the Aesthetic of Kierkegaard. You can see the part-whole relationship there going on, how this aesthetic world of possibility is created, and Kierkegaard had three types of human being stages. I think I've talked about this. The aesthetic, which is the world of possibilities. So this is what Adorno is going to look at, how this aesthetic was created in bourgeois society by an ostracized person, right, who, basically lived in Copenhagen coffee houses and wrote very, very dialectical books, but dialectics of the spirit, not of matter. He's not a Marxist, but a great dialectical thinker, Kierkegaard. And at the same time, how this aesthetic was really created, right, by very similar to the bourgeois interiors of that time. He has a very interesting kind of outside-inside going on with Kierkegaard in this thing. The other kind of man is the ethical, the one who makes choices, chooses one's life work. That's the ethical man. And then there's the moral. And the moral man is the famous leap of faith. And he uses Abraham, the leap of faith, the moral man, who is Abraham in the Old Testament, who, as an ethical person, would never sacrifice his own son. But as a religious person, hearing God's call and the test, will do so and must have a leap of faith in order to do so. And this was Kierkegaard's his working premise in terms of how does one become, quote, moral. And it's actually an inversion of the distinction that Hegel makes between moral society and civil society, the ethical realm versus the moral realm. And this has a long history. The history of Manners, Cyclichkeit in German, is the history of ethical or the history of ethos versus that of the history of the moral. So Kierkegaard takes that on as this leap of faith, which Adorno is very well aware of. Very, extremely well aware. Lukács, by the way, too, started off with Kierkegaard, a book called The Soul in Form. Soul in Form. So it's kind of interesting they both started, as did most of the existentialists, such as, if you want to group Heidegger in there, I don't really group, but Heidegger, Sartre, and others, and especially the Christian existentialists, looked at Kierkegaard as the father of a kind of modern, mainly because he said about Hegel figured out everything, but he left out man. He figured out the whole system, etc., but he forgot the subjectivity. So this was the kind of birth of modern subjectivity, at least of the generation of the turn of the century and all the way through the 1930s. Kierkegaard in The Singular Universal, another very good dialectical piece by Sartre. So I'm just bringing this up because this is a reaction, a kind of dialectical reaction to the Hegelian system, and it's even more idealist in a lot of ways too, unless you have beliefs in the Almighty. I heard a homeless guy he announced the death of God for the umpteenth time since Nietzsche on the thing today. Even God, you can kill him. You can kill him. He's going on the subway ride up here on the C train. You can kill him too. I said, I'm with you, brother. It's been done before. Yeah.
You gave him some money?
Yeah, I gave money for that one. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's as good as Homeless Man. The reproduction of the joyful wisdom. Yeah. He's going on about all the people that are trying to kill him, but even God. But he can be killed too.
Well, he was killed.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
He was the last Christian, right?
Nietzsche said Christ was the last Christian, not God.
Well,
yeah, he said the last Christian died on the cross.
Zizek says, or Zizek says that God died on the cross.
Oh, he did? He did say that? Yeah.
Well,
Nietzsche said, I thought Nietzsche was more intelligent. First of all, Nietzsche premised his remarks that Christianity was the most intelligent Jewish conspiracy of all, number one, and that the last Christian died on the cross. Yeah.
Because Nietzsche right from the standpoint of the Christian. That's why he
Yes, I understand this. Yes. Nietzsche had the Antichrist already in mind, right?
Zizek calls himself a Christian atheist.
Uh-huh. That means negative theology in dialectical terms, right? Yes. Okay. Well, anyway, let's take a look. So again, he eludes the simple alternative with the either or. And either or, by the way, the book was written to his fiancée, Kierkegaard, Regine Olson. Why he couldn't marry her. Yes. Big talk. Can you imagine? I mean, this is my rejection. Either or. Right.
So did he call off the marriage?
Yeah, he did. Yeah. Yeah.
Protestant Guild.
Regine Olson was her name. Yeah, but Heavy Guild, Scandinavian. Yeah.
That's where the dreams
Right. Or classifying, of course, classificatory logic that goes back, and and a lot of the scientific medical complexes, Linnaeus's tables and all this, classificatory logic. So he's going against that. Compartmentalizing thought. Acute opposition of dialectic towards the standard forms of thinking today, no recipes and no schemas, right? So our good friend Rick Wolff, there are recipes and schemas in his dialectics. I mean, I was rereading Knowledge in class. I mean, I have to talk to him, really thinking, in those days at Amherst. Maybe this New York trip for him is making him more
He
simplistic.
wrote Knowledge in class.
He did with Steve Resnick, yeah.
That's from the 80s.
Yeah, in the 80s.
And so you're saying that's very different from how
Very
it's seen
different of
now.
his dialectic today, which is much more of a kind of left populism. I mean, really what's being described here, you can take recipes and schemas as a kind of new form of populism. I mean, it's important to maybe get people involved in some ways, but in another way, it's not really, a dialectic thinking as Adorno would like to have it, or really, for that matter, Marx. This is obviously a very careful reading of Marx. Marx never wrote a treatise on dialectics, but he obviously talked about it, and practiced it. So, yeah. So, new seriousness of the Hegelian demand to abandon oneself to the matter, right, to the matter itself. Right, to abandon. This is an interesting phrase. You abandon yourself. You're not going to dominate it. And this has been a critique too of labor dominating nature in the Marxist tradition. Another thing that kind of pushed, Marx outside of the environmental discussion for a long time until we started to get books from like John Bellamy or O'Connor, John Bellamy Foster, and these people. They kind of tried to read what. Murray Bookchin, right, of course, yeah. So, to abandon oneself to the matter itself, In Heideggerian terms, this would be letting the things be as they are, right? Instead of the matter, of abandoning oneself, the letting be, instead of the abandonment. Okay, this is precisely the anti-subjectivistic aspect. No longer does the subject dominate the object, like in number one, right? In terms of the word for object in Latin is ab eccio, and it means to throw oneself against, right? So you have this kind of subject object. When you talk about the world of objects, you're throwing yourself against it, right? On it, right? And it's very interesting, the way this plays out in language as well.
It's a verb.
Yes,
It's
ab
like
eccio.
our English word I object.
Yes, that's right, yeah. And then the Germans have all kinds of levels. You have object, for the Cartesian res extensa, and then they use Gegenstand, you're standing against the object. This is the beginning of a kind of dialectical opposition. So these are all, very interesting. Again, unfortunately, we're working, fortunately and unfortunately, ambiguously working in the English language, because you have to remember a lot of the stuff that we're, interpreting was written in German, right? The Marx wrote Capital in German, told the French to slow down. They want to rush to things. He wrote that letter when he published the, to his friend in Paris.
It's an interesting thing on the side.
Yeah, sure.
So how
Yeah.
are we supposed to think then?
Yes, that's good. Yeah, I was going to go there, but please do it.
No, I mean, it just
Yeah.
says we need models instead of completeness.
Yes, we
Because
need
models are open.
This is
Subject
great,
to
though.
change.
Do we get it through inspiration, amateurship, appeal to our hunches, playing our hunches? Answer through the unity of the thoughts which express the matter against the usual analysis in terms of parts, models instead of completeness, right? Yeah, and he writes a book. I mean, by the way, another thing in Adorno's career, he wrote a book using models. He wrote a book on critical models, it's called. Yeah, 2 volumes. Yeah. Personally, I find this to be a great introduction to the negative dialectics. It's a great companion piece to reading the negative dialectics of Adorno, and also a book he wrote called Against the Metacritique of Knowledge, or Against Epistemology. I think this is a great, even though the book Against Epistemology was written in 34 to 37, I think this book really illuminates a lot of that thought there. This was, and then the book Negative Dialectics, which is a, ongoing critique of Heidegger in particular, and the phenomenological tradition was, probably finally published in the 50s, right? And it wasn't translated until, the 70s here, and really has never really demanded a lot of commentary, unfortunately. And again, this friend of mine who's a translator, has the contract to translate. He's been working on it 12 years, and he won't talk to me about it. When I ask him, how's it going?
One book by Adorno, 12
Negative Dialectics, and he's translated 8 other books by Adorno, so it's not like he doesn't have German. So I don't know what's going on. Maybe he's what?
He's just slow.
He's slow. Yeah, I'm
Must
going
be
to tell
very
him that.
difficult.
I'm going to tell
The
him
text
that.
must be
Yeah.
English
Well, he did aesthetic theory.
Oh.
Very difficult too, but yeah. The 3 big books for Adorno, at least in my mind, are Against Epistemology, the Negative Dialectics, and Aesthetic Theory. Yeah. So
I think he spent too much time in Fairway.
he's in tip-top shoes. Unlike you, his home is his residence is tip-top and Harry shoes up here. Yeah, loves going shoe shopping.
Michael, how about this question?
Yeah, I'm listening now.
Of finitude,
Yeah.
of the finitude of content.
Where are we now? You're
Well,
down a little bit,
rather
right?
than on the notes in the main outline.
Yes. The next one that does not begin with definitions, or where do you see the finitude, though?
Alleged straitjacket of concepts, that's not the case. Relative irrelevance of Socratic scheme, the strict sense dialectic, not a method in the sense of subjective production, but precisely the opposite, a pure looking on self-evaluative manner. Most typical objection dialectic recognizes only contradiction rather than simple difference. The concept of contradiction is not to be hypothesized. It simply means that every finite...
Where are you, Peter? I'm sorry. Yeah, my apologies, though. But.
Where did we begin? On the controversy of rationalism?
Oh, in the text itself.
In the text itself.
Oh, going back. Okay. Okay, if you don't mind, hold that thought real quickly. There are only 2 more of these, and we can go from there. Because, I think this is a very good, step, maybe nodal points one can use to read the whole thing from his notes about it. Dialectic does not begin with definitions, the concepts already appear phenomenology. He says see essay as form. He wrote a piece called Essay as Form, which I recommend reading if you like to write essays and you want to know what an essay really is. A beautiful piece on what an essay is. The essay as a form of writing, right? Okay, owe their form to the context, right? And also change in their internal composition through the movements of thought. So, this is, shifting context, and this, of course, is the historical example of the dialectic. The foolish aspect of definition as an avoidance of things. You can see the fight. Define your terms, right? The duel, right? Define your terms, right? All right. Exemplification through the concept of the individual in relation to the concept of society, a concept which involves both the identical and the non-identical. The need to analyze this double concept of involvement with regard to the individual. Okay? And then finally, concepts must be considered in their mutual configuration, then taken in isolation. Reasons for opposing the arbitrary character of conceptual definitions attempt to do justice to the life of the matter itself in terms of the concept. This naturally, involves a critique of the usual separation of subject and object, that is, of the assumption that the object is characteristic in itself and acquires any categorical determination solely through the subject. In this sense, all dialectic, including the idealistic dialectic, is opposed to the traditional theory of knowledge. Characterization of dialectic, a form of thought which does not recognize the separation of philosophy from the sciences, that is, which brings philosophical motifs into substantive questions of knowledge, and, for example, the philosophical critique of definition, the reluctance to define. Okay, so Beth, what were we going to?
Just maybe at some point.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe everyone understands this identical, non-identical definition of.
Well, I think
that,
your
the
section,
identical
your
and
example
maybe
is a good one to work with today when we get to that. The human being.
to understand
The
what
X
he
and
means
the
by the
non-X.
identical.
Yes, I think that was a
non-identical.
good example. Good example.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Peter, where did you want to go? Any
Let's-
thoughts about
no,
this?
no,
This is a
but
kind of an
let's
open.
go back to
Yeah.
the two, but first let's do this thing on where the concepts come from. Because, it's an interesting question.
Where do concepts come from?
Yeah, he says here the question
yeah.
is the concepts owe their form to content.
Yeah,
They also change its from composition through the movement of thought.
right. And this is very Hegelian, what he's doing. Very Hegelian.
So we begin
Yeah,
please.
please.
With the first categories are the categories that the whole presents itself through. And then you work through those to get to the... Is that your reading?
The category, first of all, it's not category.
Well,
Right, it's not a category. It's either a concept. It's not a category. Category is after all of this. Right.
But the concepts are already imminent to...
Categories already have definition, and as Chris pointed out last week, it's part of the accusation, and the categorien has an accusative form. It's an accusative case already. Yeah. So you're already thinking substantially at that level. Yeah. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
This is already given
Yeah.
in terms of the concrete
Yeah.
society we find ourselves in, correct?
Right. This is also found, yes, through the movement of thought. That's
The movement of
Hegelian,
the
right?
concept, he
Yes,
said.
the movement
Follows
of the
Hegel's,
concept, yes.
The movement of the concept
Right.
must be what the dialectic does. It traces the movement of the concept. It is the movement of the concept.
Right. I would add another phrase to this that's kind of important, and it's a great, unfortunately it's never been translated into English, but the patience of the concept too, which means the passion of the concept. How long the concept itself, right, takes to really, how much it changes internally, that you never have a fixed, quote unquote, concept. I mean, one way of thinking about this, we never have this fixity, or a kind of finite, that you were going to talk about earlier, the finite, finite being of the concept, if you will, right? Yeah. So you have in the dialectical tradition, you have a person like you have Kojève and Bataille, who'll talk about the labor of the concept, right? And the negative, And then you'll have people like Jean Cavelier who'll talk about the dialectic of the concept, how this is going on. So it's both the movement, again, the form to the context, not to the content, but to the context. This is what he's saying. And then the change in the internal composition, which is happening in the movement of thought.
The finitude is
right,
the dimension of the content.
Right.
As opposed
Of the content. But he's using the form to the context, not content. Form and context is what he's talking about here. Not form and content. He has a different, instead of the traditional form content, he has a form context thing here, right?
Then he says phenomenology.
Yeah.
Above, you pass a little arrow, he added phenomenology after context.
Right, but the concept is always already appearing, right, in phenomenology, right. This is not a critique of phenomenology.
No,
No.
that's what I'm saying.
No.
That's what I'm
No.
saying.
Okay, yeah.
That the concept is in the appearance of
That which
experience.
appears to us or phenomenalizes itself is already, yes, within the concept, right? And then there's the shift with context as well, and also internal movement of thought. So it's always this movement that is happening, which people forget because we're so conditioned into thinking fixities, right? Deductively, all these kind of patterns that we have of our own thought processes, that this is really much more about movement, right? It's much more plasticity, if you will, right, in thought than it is, fixity or any kind of rigidity.
It's interesting.
And this is a way of avoiding classification. You want to say something? Yeah, please.
Sorry, again, just making me think of what he talked about with his interpretation of Hegel's truth being result.
Yes.
Right?
That's a good...
Can you speak about that a little bit? Because that seems to be what this is all leading to, because I think Peter's question pointed to the idea is like, fine, we have concepts immanent to us, right? But to understand and give a definition in the first place, it has to be related to something else.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
In this case, Adorno's saying you got to relate it back to the concept itself and then to the context that it shows up to sort of start developing it, right?
Right.
So what? The truth of the situation.
So the beginning is the end, or the end, the result is really in the beginning. Yes.
Well, maybe because it also has,
okay,
because he says in the first, I forget in a couple of lectures, he says that the dialectic is a method, but it's also within the matter itself, right? So we have thoughts, so we can do Lukácsian sort of, maybe he's a little bit too harsh on Lukács, but I don't know. I have to read
You
more
ain't seen
Lukács.
nothing else yet until you get to the later lectures. Yeah.
But, Lukács, like a caricature of Lukács would be, like interpreting Marx's sort of phrase that Marx said, unfortunate phrase that Adorno says Marx said, was sort of localizing dialectic, the method, right? The sort of thought which then uncovers, right? And so once we do that, we still encounter the dialectic within the matter itself again. So this is why the concept has to be a movement, because the moment we think, we disturb or we engage with the context, which is also the matter itself, is disturbed, right, with our thought and our actions, or because we uncover contradictions within the matter itself as well. So we can never stop, because to stop means we can actually solve the contradictions within matter itself, and that's clearly impossible. So this is the requirement for thought to keep constantly in flux and to sort of have these kinds of negations. And of course, the negation is not an external. He keeps repeating that. It's not something that like dogmatic, like bad Soviet Marxism would say. This is a concept. And then, of course, you can have its negation. And the negation would be something totally out of left field that comes and basically redefines it as not being true. And he's saying, and Adorno's saying, no, the concept actually is never ending. It just sort of, it's like shape-shifting.
It contains its own contradiction, the
Right.
concept.
It contains its own contradiction,
Yes, within the concept.
because of this duality, because
And
it's a contradiction within its
Think
own
of this
thought.
politically with Stalin and the show trials.
What?
Think of it politically in terms of the effects.
Well, that's an uncomfortable thought,
Yeah.
because maybe Stalin understood this too.
No, how does the show trials relate to this? What's your point?
Well, think about how if the the negation is not also in the movement, right, and is only applied to the concept at that time, what the party can dictate at any time, to its people. At the same time, yes, as you said, one of the arguments against Lukács, and I think this is where Stanley wanted to go, is that, it really is, Adorno's trying to synthesize both the dialectics of nature and the dialectics of the social. This is, it seems to be the grand attempt here in this book, that he's really taken into account both Engels and that early stage in dialectical thinking, that was maybe refined by a lot of people, as well as, the Lukács social. Whereas Lukács only dialectics only applies to the social. Doesn't have anything to do with, the matter, right? You're acting upon it, of course. You're transforming it, but it's not in the, quote, thing itself or in the matter itself that these contradictions are happening. So there's an imposition.
Michael, what's going to explain the incapacity or the rarity of dialectical thinking in this case? Because if the concept is immanent to the context.
Right.
Why is it so difficult to recognize it?
If the concept is immanent to the context?
Yeah. If we don't begin with rules, right? If it's not a method, then that's strict.
Yes, I understand.
If we don't begin with definitions, what's the point of departure and why is it that difficult?
There's no
If it's-
point of departure for the dialectic.
I know, yeah, well, yes, but but it has to be, there is some
I like that.
yeah. There has to be
I think it has to be that leap that Adorno says at one point. You got to leap into it. Yeah, like a Nietzschean.
I mean, it's a matter of imagination, it's a matter of not being miseducated. What's the...
Well, certainly we're all miseducated.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. Right?
But also it's the hegemony,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
hegemony of
Yeah,
positivism.
well, that's another thing too. I mean, it
It's
seems to me
because it's so familiar it becomes...
that's a possibility. As a friend of mine once said, the first time he read Capital, he said it made perfect sense to him. So, I mean, you could talk about that. Why does that make perfect sense to a young person, in his 20s, and he reads Capital and said, "It's exactly what I've been experiencing all my life." Came home perfectly to him.
Well, where does
Perfectly
Hegel-
logical.
where
Yeah,
does
I
Hegel
mean, this is a
start?
question again of the a priori. Do we have to have experience of the thing itself in order to know it? This is what he's leaving open, right? In some ways, this goes back.
And it's not
you
an
know,
ontology, he says.
It's not an ontology, yeah, and it's not positivism.
Right.
Yeah, these are the two
It's
dialectics.
immanent. It's almost like a
Yeah.
Deleuzian thing. That's where Deleuze goes, it seems like.
Well, that's a very different. It's not dialectical in Deleuze's
Where does
sense. Or,
Hegel start? He starts with sense
Phenomenological then,
perception.
right?
what's that?
It has to be phenomenological.
It is phenomenological.
Right,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's, how does it show up to our experience, right?
Right.
How does justice...
How does
show
it
up?
appear? How does it appear?
Hegel starts with sense perception. In the phenomenology. That's where
Yes.
he begins.
Yes, if
And
you
then
look at
from
these
there
notes,
he
by the
forms
way.
concepts.
Yeah, just to pick up on
Or
that
he
for a
calls them
second.
notions.
Pick up on that in a second. In the lectures, he'll begin with a general plan, and you can see dialectical models number 6. This is on page 222. And he goes through the models. The model of sense certainty, which is fundamentally from Plato through Descartes, all the way to the empiricists, right? Then the phenomenology of the master and slave, lordship and bondage, we talked about, that you know, Chris, right?
What
And
page was it, sorry?
This is the first page on the notes,
On the
page
notes,
220. Yeah. Then he'll go through the unhappy consciousness, which is suffering, right? And also the consciousness that cannot take the risk, instead of leap. Maybe we could talk about the risk of the imagination, going back to Peter's question. Essence and individuality, the ethical life, which is another, part of the phenomenology. Conscience, right? And guilt, as some of you know from reading Nietzsche, that conscience and guilt go hand in hand, and debt. Absolute freedom and the terror. That's the reading, Hegel's reading the French Revolution, but we could talk about that, too. And then he has the dialectical models from the logic. So you have the two, you have 6 through lecture 11. The background here is both the phenomenology, the logic of Hegel, right? And then he does a resume, number 11, on Hegel's method. And the materialist dialectic begins in 12 with a critique, Marx's great critique, beginning with Proposition 262 of the philosophy of right, right?
Well, he's got, it's 2 texts. One is the critique of Hegel.
Yeah,
theory
philosophy
of
of right, right?
And then
he
has
begins
also
with Proposition
a critique
262,
of,
the critique,
philosophy of
right? The critique of the philosophy of right. So, and this is the beginning of the master of the materialistic dialectic.
But those are both early writings. That's 40.
Yes, I know.
43, 44.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Right? So you can see the models here, and then he goes to models further down. I mean, this is why this is a very good starting point to my opinion, because it gives you some kind of mapping, to work with. I'm not saying that just read this and fill in the blanks, read the text now in a different way. But anyway, then you can see 16 he'll deal with ideology. He'll talk about the open dialectic. 13, the control of history as a history of class conflicts, and the dialectic of exchange relations as central issue alla Caratani. I'm sure there's an extract there that we could, certainly use in some of our readings of, Kojin Karatani has written a book from modes of production to modes of exchange, a new book called The Structure of History, in which he wants to privilege, and he thinks one big mistake Marxists have made was privileging the modes of production over the modes of exchange, and he goes through 4 different modes of exchange, and does so very dialectically. We have problems with some of his schemas reading it, but anyway, he'll talk about the original as reciprocity and gift economies. The second moment of the mode of exchange is the plunder and redistribution. The third is the commodity form and the beginning of mercantile capital. And he moves through that all the way up to contemporary times. And then the mode of exchange D is the kind of a return to gift and reciprocity that we've been very dissatisfied with, but it's a new way of, so to speak, looking at structures in history. So he's trying to do this dialectically, in which A, B, C are all interpenetrating each other. They're not just this is the mode only at this time. That there are elements in each transition that you go through in each period of the mode of exchange. So anyway, to go back to Adorno here, then ideology, and then you can see the models that he has, and this is great. I mean, the overproduction, elucidation of society by critical destruction. This would be part of the negative dialectic, right? And that he's working with. Dialectic of the concept of freedom, the very concept of materialism itself. So this is again a critique, I think, of probably of a lot of the Diamat, of that group, right? Dialectic of concepts, the state and politics, and then the aesthetic dialectic, which he fleshes out in his book Aesthetic Theory, because he's working on an aesthetic too, and then our own concept of it, and then our own models. And I don't think he finished all of it because they supposedly broke for Easter break. So he only gave 20 lectures, like Stanley. He got sick at Thanksgiving. But anyway, they broke for.
He ended in August.
Yeah. Well, he framed this. This was the outline that he did in April 22nd, 1958. Uh-huh. This is when the outline was done. Yeah, the outline was done, and then he did his lecture notes after that, right? And then the lectures, yes, began in the summer session, right? In May 8th, right? And yeah, I guess Easter was late that year. Maybe they celebrated Greek Easter, which is usually 2-3 years. No, they didn't celebrate in Germany. No. Okay.
Never in August.
No, not in August. They began in May. The lectures. Maybe you had to miss them.
Yeah, but they break off at the end of July.
They said Easter.
Do the rest of these have corresponding pages all the way down to 21 to
I think they're in the
22?
lectures. You can probably get that in the lectures. I don't know if it's really just a correspondence per se, but you can kind of hint, even in the lectures. Yeah.
Not necessarily in these notes.
Not necessarily, right. But I would think that you probably would see a lot of this in beginning, the materialistic dialectic, beginning by, lecture 12, 13.
Roman numerals refer to?
And that's on what page? What is it?
It's like page 2. It says 2 at the top. It's after July 1958, number 50. I don't know.
Okay, I'll look. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Like, does that refer to?
I see 12th of June. Wait.
I don't know. It doesn't matter.
15th of July?
Yeah, like what does the Roman numeral refer to?
Oh, that's a footnote.
Oh, okay.
That's a footnote number 12. Yeah, that's, if you turn to page, I don't know where the footnote, they have, this is on pagination here. Yeah. But the lectures, the following notes were on sheets 1 to 5, which he conceived as whole, provide the basis for the remaining lectures delivered from the 17th of July to the 31st. So that's what that footnote means. Yeah. Right. You can see his Nietzschean thinking starting near the twilights of the failure, right, instead of the twilight of the idols in 58. Okay.
Although some
Yeah.
things in the outline don't actually appear in the.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
No, but there's a lot to work with here.
Yes.
I mean, there are at least 5 to 10 dissertations in here. First, right? At least, huh? Right. Yeah. Yeah. Who said thinking didn't have a commodification value? Huh?
You know, it's interesting. The index doesn't have models. You know. So he probably, I wonder if he just never uses that.
Well, like I said, if you're really interested in Adorno, Critical Models is a book that you can get. I mean, that you can read in terms of his use of models and also, how he does this. Yeah, and I think part of it was Sam Weber. Sam Weber translated that one. And Prisms is very good if you want to read first-rate criticism on Franz Kafka, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Some excellent Utopia. He has very good essay as an essayist as well. And then about 8 books on music, including Mahler, Berg, Schoenberg, Beethoven, Wagner, In Search of Wagner, which is light years ahead of our friend Badiou, by the way. Badiou doesn't do well with Wagner compared to Adorno, and philosophy of music, etc. So I mean, pretty far-ranging. Literature, philosophy, painting, very under theorized, right? But literature, some poetry, certainly philosophy, social theory. The aesthetic doesn't really do much with painting. I guess in the Marxist tradition, that's still Meyer Shapiro would be still the giant on that, if anybody knows his work on modern art and his book on Picasso, first-rate stuff. Whom Derrida argues with in a book called Truth in Painting. It's a very interesting, attempt to use Merleau-Ponty and Meyer Shapiro together. All right, so you want to go to this section on examples? Yeah, next. Is that? Yeah. I mean, I think Stanley was going to concentrate on Lecture 7. I think that's at least what we were talking about yesterday a little bit. Maybe if I hadn't been there, he would have showed up. He figured, I'm just briefing Michael. I'll take the day off.
Hustle.
Yeah, hustle me. Anyway, so maybe we can begin with this on page 67. Page 67, back in Lecture 7, and go to what Beth had mentioned earlier. At the bottom of the page, well, anyway, maybe we could, because this is really about the principle of dialectical contradiction. This lecture is fundamentally about the principle of dialectical contradiction. So he says, this is an important point for you can see here, and the important point is the limit, going back to what Peter was talking about in terms of finitude, the finitude in thinking, the limit, right? He says, at the top of the page, if I failed to step beyond this limit, that is, if I did not myself already possess some absolute cognition as one who expressly reflects upon reason itself, then I could never speak of this limit at all. Okay? And this to me is very much Plato at work, in a way. This is very operative in the a priori or that is in the Meno, in the dialogue with Meno, which, the slave boy is able to, somewhat solve a problem in geometry. Right? And how did he get this knowledge? Without formal schooling or anything.
He remembers.
He remembers, yes. Well, that's the process. Yes. They have to get to that yes. Right? Okay.
He got that from Good Will Hunting. He stole that Plato from
Who did?
Plato. He stole the idea from
Who stole it?
Plato.
From whom?
Hollywood, from Good Will Hunting.
Oh, yeah, Good Will Hunting, yeah. That's right. He stole it from Hollywood. They'd like to think so, certainly, in Tinseltown. Okay, so I did not already possess some absolute cognition as one who expressly reflects upon reason itself, then I could never speak of this limit at all. The limit must at once posited, be at once posited and transcended. So you have this double movement. You know, we've talked about this, the people that have been in Heidegger, we've talked about positing, you know, and positing is basically the etymological material, etymology, if you will, of positivism. We're positing things into the world. Yeah, from which position and other things all come from. Yeah, so you're positing out. And the transcendent, you know, we've talked about the dual step. You know, you're both the stepping back from the phenomena in terms of the process of reflection and articulation. So anyway, in this moment that the limit is acknowledged in all seriousness as unavoidably posited, but as one that must nonetheless be transcended, you have the simple form of logical contradiction which the thinking encounters once it no longer moves naively within the realm of either formological, or merely empirical knowledge, but actually becomes a philosophy of reflection. And this is very important, this principle of reflection in this chapter, right? And its relationship to reason. Right? In other words, once it moves in a realm where the empirical moment and the formal moment can be recognized as mediated with one another. Page 67, top of the page. This is an important point, for you see here that Hegel does not simply cast formal logic overboard, as it has often so cheaply been accused of doing, right? And just philosophize away, regardless, as if there were no such thing as the principle of contradiction. And to suggest that would be to get Hegel entirely wrong. In the first place, he acknowledges the validity of the principle of contradiction for the normal realm of knowledge established by the understanding. That is, both for our normal empirical knowledge and for the field of formal logic, not as for any other form of thought. But when just as for any other form of thought, I'm sorry. But when I relate as a reflective subject, that is, when I do not just focus direct attention upon formal propositions or context, but rather I think through the relationships between the moments, these moments themselves, then I actually find that the form in which they can be grasped is solely and precisely the form of contradiction itself rather than the form of blank identity. What's the matter?
Well, I'm just grappling with that one.
Okay, well, maybe we'll read it again. Yeah.
That'll help.
And then I actually find that the form in which they can be grasped is solely and precisely the form of contradiction itself rather than the form of blank identity. When I reflect as a reflective subject, I do not just focus my attention on the objects, right, upon the formal propositions of the contents, but I think through the relationship between these moments themselves. What's going on in these moments. So you have this temporal aspect, very, very important in Hegel. You know, when we say in that moment, right? In the moment, right? Etc. What is denied, therefore, is not the contradiction of form and content, or any contradiction of this kind, for such contradiction remains in force as far as our finite and our limited knowledge is concerned. But precisely insofar as this knowledge attains self-consciousness, and this is Hegel in the Phenomenology, I brought the thing and read the sections if necessary, or expressly reflects back upon itself, it comes to realize that contradiction. So it's in this process, this movement of self-reflective activity, that to realize the contradiction which you must deploy as a criterion of correctness is at the same time the organon of truth. That is, it comes to realize that every particular instance of knowledge becomes knowledge only through and by means of contradiction. And this is the way in which this negative principle, emphasis, this principle of contradiction is actually derived from the Kantian doctrine of the antinomies, as Hegel presents it. You will rightly expect me at this point to provide some further clarification of these issues. See, Brett, he's got you here. In terms of a specific model, as it were. I do not wish to disappoint this expectation, but I should also tell you that in doing so, I would actually contravene Hegel's own practice in a serious way. For Hegel was always extraordinarily skeptical towards the concept of examples. There are a couple of passages in the encyclopedias where Hegel rather ostentatiously rejects the suggestion that he should provide examples.
And they have a footnote here that said they couldn't actually find any such passages in Hegel's.
It's in the Waste Book.
In the
It's a book called The Waste Book. We call it the Waste Book because Hegel was going to discard this stuff. I have the book. It's where he also said reading the morning newspaper is the morning prayer. Yeah. Which is bad, this is your morning prayer is your New York Times, I guess. And I have other prayers than the New York Times, but anyway, the New York Times, the modern parody. But anyway, okay, why Hegel should act in this fashion? Why should he refuse to furnish examples? And it is especially difficult for pre-dialectical consciousness to understand Hegel properly in this regard. Is not so hard to grasp, for the concept of example always presupposes that we have a universal conceptual range or field. Okay, and again, parts and wholes here. Okay? Good. Okay? At our disposal, something which is firm and reliable, positively given, a reified result, which can be exemplified in the particular case which it subsumes. But in Hegel, the very conception of a universal logical field within which the particular is grasped is suspended, or at least here on the level of the speculative concept. That is to say, there is here no universal conceptual field which includes so many things within it. For the universal conceptual field consists precisely in the life of the particular grasped within it. It fulfills itself through the particular. It does not merely cover or include the particular, but rises out of it. It has its life in the particular, and nothing particular can thus be regarded as a merely lifeless example which has been abstracted from it. And this is, in fact, what makes it so extraordinarily difficult when one is required to think dialectically to provide an example of the dialectic. I'm going to stop here for a second because our friend Peter wrote a piece. Greek is the universal case, right? Greece is the universal.
Concrete dialect.
Yeah, concrete dialect. Yeah. You said the concrete universal.
Oh, concrete, yeah, yes.
Yes, you did. Yes. Yeah, no, I'll
was
remember
in
it.
situation.
Yeah, so maybe he did a piece for situations. So maybe you could talk about how that would work, why Greece would be a concrete universal in the
What,
Hegelian
concrete
sense.
universal?
Yeah, no, or what, how we would use it in this context.
As in an example of a
Yeah,
certain
well, Greece is a universal here in this case, right?
It exhibits tendencies
Right.
that are common to all societies.
Right.
Common to
Right.
usual societies.
Right.
Let's say. And the tendencies were two. One was the impossibility of reform,
Right.
the increasing rigidity of the state apparatuses, and becoming increasingly detached from political movements, from popular classes. And secondly, the impossibility of revolution in a sense, because the liberal ethos now makes that kind of risk-taking more or less unthinkable. People are less and less willing to risk their material well-being for some kind of higher principle. So the crisis unfolding in Greece is a product of those two tendencies. That was Greece shows us the future. What Greece is today, the U.S. will be in 5, 8, 10, 12 years from now. And the example was of course, in Marx, who when he published the first volume of Capital, put in the preface to the German edition, to the readers in German, not to think of the examples Marx gives, which are more or less all from England,
Right.
as the advanced case of industrial capitalism.
Right.
To think of it as something that is an English phenomenon, because it says that's the tale is told of you. It's about your society too. They're
Right.
just more advanced, but you want to get there very quickly. And of course,
Right.
it was correct.
So, this would be an example of the sentence that he says the universal conceptual field consists precisely in the life of the particular
Yes.
in which it grasps within it and fulfills itself through the particular, right? It does not merely cover or include the particular, but arises out of it. Okay, so let's,
And
go
similar-
ahead,
and a
yeah,
similar
please,
concept then is why, for example, the Marxism of the working class is the universal class, let's say. Because it is to the particularity of the working class that you achieve the universal. The same way in Hegel, of course, it is public servants. It is to their particularity because public servants, as a particular group, are about the universal, the, let's say, objective, the common good, or the public will, that they're able to overcome particularities. Their own particularity allows them to overcome particularity.
So
Same
Hegel,
thing with the working class.
So Hegel, in some ways, is already talking about the universal bureaucratic state.
Of course.
I mean, this is really what it is. The real is the rational, and the rational is the real. Really, ultimately means this vast, very elaborate description of what the bureaucratic state looks like. So, in some ways, code words that were put out in the French Communist Party, by the more imaginative ones, Hegel became a code word for Stalin. And during certain periods, which was interesting because of what was considered then Soviet bureaucracy or bureaucratic state is playing out here, rather than an emancipatory. This was one reading, just one reading. I'm not saying I agree. It is a kind of example of what.
Well, it's not a bad reading of philosophy, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Which should be read alongside. If you're going to read Hegel, I would do the phenomenology and the philosophy of right. I would leave the logic to the quote-unquote specialists, if you will, or certain parts of it you could do. But, you could read Jean Hippolyte's Logique et Existence, which is a very good, explication of it. But philosophy of right is certainly worth reading, especially the passage from the family to civil society to the state. These are very crucial moments in terms of how the administered world, in Adorno's case, Adorno and Horkheimer will speak of the administered world. We're very much in that right now. I mean, to put it mildly, globalization is an administered world. In a lot of ways, what we're seeing globally. We have all those organizations. So anyway, we'll go to the human being now. I'm sorry we were at the state, but I thought it was a good example of Greece being a part, ultimately, of the whole in this move, these relations, and seeing this as a good example. As a novel,
fundamental problem, and how these questions are examined.
Yes.
The dominant discourse on Greece was to show its difference rather than sameness.
Yes.
In that sense.
Yes.
To show what a peculiar case the Greek situation is.
Right.
Whereas, in fact, I mean, if you have even a modicum of accuracy in terms of just the empirical situation, you say, well, I mean, the crisis is well beyond. There were something peculiar to the Greeks. Why the Irish? Why the Portuguese? Why the Lithuanians? Why the all the Baltic states? Why Puerto Rico? Going down the list.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the big mistake for the Americans was when Merkel offered to exchange Greece for Puerto Rico. I mean, I guess they couldn't have predicted the hurricane at that point. In hindsight,
Right.
We should have made
I don't think our friend Wilbur Ross would have gone for that one, since he bought all the banks in Greece during the crisis. Our dear Secretary of Commerce.
Ross did?
Yeah. Well, Ross bought. We go to Alpha Bank on the island with him. I tell Peter, Wilbur Ross bought this bank last week, right during the crisis.
Peter, I thought it was very interesting that you described the concrete universal as a tendency.
Yeah.
I thought that word to me was very key. It's rather than what's happening as a condition.
Yes.
But it's a tendency that actually
Yes.
universal.
Yes.
I thought it was very.
Yeah, but it points to the universality. It's a tendency, that is universal. And I think always we should be looking to sameness rather than difference. I mean, difference, of course, is a given. We have, we live in a world of difference. But the question is sameness.
And in this case, Adorno is actually describing dialectical contradiction. He's not describing difference. This is another thing too that goes back to Hegel, and when he writes about the difference between the Fichtean and the Schellian, systems of difference too. So this is again an elaborate set of problems, but it's very interesting that here it's about dialectical contradiction. He'll bring in difference later, but yeah. So anyway, so this is the example he gives. I would like to try and offer you an example here. Indeed, a rather simple and elementary one, and you may think a rather shocking one. Let us take the proposition X. Max Horkheimer is a human being, right? The first thing we might say about this proposition, insofar as it subsumes Mr. X, under the logical species human being, is obviously that it is correct, assuming that we are talking about a human being as distinguished from, say, other biological species. But consider for a moment what this means. X is a human being. A human, we have said, if in general you say X is a human being, as in the case of the usual logical form, A is B, very traditional form of logic here, there's a certain problem in this, for that the A that is supposed to be B here is not the whole of B. Rather, B is a universal, and the A is only a specific representative of the former. There's indeed an identity here insofar as the particular phenomena, that is, the individual A, is subsumed under concept B. Now, Hegel would say what is formally implied here, that X is indeed a human being, though in expressing this in the logical form A is B, you see A is precisely not the whole of B, but is actually the representative of B. Actually has a very serious meaning. For he would say, and this I think also reveals something of the rigor and the remarkable freedom of the almost playful superiority which dialectical thought actually involves, that if I subsume the X under the concept of the human being, then the concept of human being includes everything possible which the individual X is, in fact, is not. He would not simply content himself, therefore, with a primitive biological definition of human being, but would say instead, if we are talking about a truly vital comprehension of the human being as such, then we must think in terms of categories such as freedom, individuation, autonomy, the possession of reason, and a host of other things, all of which are implicitly contained in the concept of human being as the objective character of the latter. And it is nothing but an act of arbitrariness to admit or ignore such categories in order to provide an operational definition of the human being as something which actually possesses these or those generic characteristics of a biological kind. We need only to listen attentively to the expression, human being. I believe to realize it involves more than just the differentia specifica that marks it off from the next nearest species, the anthropoid apes. And indeed, Hegel would say, if this emphatic dimension is always already involved in the concept of the human being, the moment that implies someone is rightly a human being, as I would put it, then the proposition X is a human being is also at the same time untrue. For the emphatic moment which is involved here, even though it may not already have clearly emerged itself as such, is certainly not yet realized here, and now in any particular existing being. One could almost say that something like a human being does not exist at all, as the emphatic concept of the human being objectively and intrinsically implies and understands this. In other words, the proposition X as a human being is right or correct, as I have said before, but also is false. And I believe that we need only to apply this proposition really seriously to any human being to indicate that the individual in question is a human being, and we will realize this difference at once. We'll realize that the individual does not yet really do justice to the concept of the human being in the emphatic sense, right? The concept of the human in terms of absolute truth. And this, of course, presupposes that we already, right, possess such an emphatic concept of the human being, ultimately the concept of a right and a genuine human being, ultimately, indeed, the concept of a right and genuine arrangement of the world in general. When we say human being, the expression says more to us than the mere generic concept or species, even if we are subjectively unaware of this. I believe I've shown you something, at least, of the climate of this thinking, something of what is really meant by the concept of dialectical contradiction. We could say that dialectic, insofar as it is a doctrine of contradiction, criticizes the simple logical coherence of the world, for contradiction or absence of contradiction, which are of course correlative concepts, is precisely the logical criterion here. One can undertake to reduce the whole of logic to non-contradiction, and this has indeed been done. Now, if we ascribe such a central role to the concept of contradiction, as Hegelian philosophy does, this implies something that I've already explicated to you in a different context. It implies we cannot just acknowledge the logical coherence of the world, cannot acknowledge without more ado that the world and our thought are identical with one another, that the world and thought essentially exhaust one another. Rather, we must acknowledge precisely that they diverge from one another. And here we must confront the paradox that this divergence between thought and world is in turn necessarily mediated through thought. Thought itself must therefore strive to grasp precisely what is not thought. And this paradox that it must try and do what it cannot do reveals itself in every particular judgment that thought makes and refers the judgment to the whole, the connected totality into which thought in its contradictory character must precisely unfold. We say in conclusion, therefore, that the Hegelian idea of contradiction follows from the emphatic conception of truth itself. This was a very good passage, didn't you, Joe?
That works if you use the comparison against Aristotelian logic, but it doesn't work with symbolic logic.
And why would you say that? I mean, I'm just kind of curious.
Because if you're going to say in symbolic logic that Mr. X is a human being, use this symbol, which is a horseshoe line, and X implies human being. Mr. X implies a human being, not X is a human being, whence all the problems arise.
So you're saying the dialectical contradiction will not apply to certain forms and logic.
Well,
they use symbolic logic in computers, artificial intelligence, and these kind of things. I mean, is that
well, I don't know.
programmers?
That'd be
No, I'm just wondering. I mean,
I don't know if you can use dialectical logic in computers. That's really
not possible.
I don't think so. But what I'm saying is that the Aristotelian logic is kind of a straw man, because it can't compete with the dialectical logic the way he puts it. So I would say, what about symbolic logic?
But how does it negate the infinite? I mean, because here we go back to this question of the finite being.
Right, exactly.
That when you try to present the concept or truth in finite terms, there's always a surplus that that it cannot represent. So at the same time, it's true and it's not true. Yes, it's true that X is a human being, but X cannot really cover the full meaning of what to be human being. I mean, that's always going to be true, whether you say it represents, symbolizes, or whatever term you want to use.
Because I'm agreeing with you here, and that is that the implication symbol subsumes the A into B. It's saying when you have Mr. X, you have a human being. It doesn't mean you have all human beings. Whenever you have Mr. X, you have a human being.
Well, that may be true, but that doesn't negate the point of what Adorno makes here in terms of the surplus that is always.
I'm just saying he's using it's a straw man to argue that Aristotelian logic doesn't work because symbolic logic would work.
I think we have to be careful, though, given Adorno's, incredible range of historical grasp here. I mean, in Aristotle, you have the logic of contraries, you have the logic of opposition, which are dialectical terms. Aristotle is a very dialectical thinker. It's not that it's just going against Aristotelian logic here. But again, as I think Peter points out, uses a good word, it's the excess or the surplus that is always the stake here. It's not especially what can be finitized in symbolic terms, through implication or, and all these distinctions that are made in symbolic logic and or symbols that are used in the 19th century.
I think I'm questioning the is. A is B then, because that's where the surplus comes. It's not A equals A or A and not A.
Yeah.
A and B. A is B.
You're questioning that this is a different construction than the principle of identity and non-identity? Is that what you're... Okay.
I want to ask a question about this example because he also says that dialectics isn't that stupid triad. He goes on to say...
Well, he does. No, it's part of dialectics, but it's not dialectics. Cannot be
Not the way
reduced
it's been
to the
used.
triadic structure of thesis, antithesis,
And he also
synthesis.
says it's not like a circle that contains the parts.
Right.
So, like, you can't see... So in this example of the human can't contain the part because the human is... Am I understanding it correctly?
That's
It's
good language,
still a thing
It's not a
in
container type of logic.
But
It's
is
good.
it because the human, as he defines it in terms of the freedom and rationality, is still a thing in evolution and cannot...
Yes, there's a temporal...
Is that what he's saying?
In lecture 2, on page 13, he says the truth is temporal. The truth has a temporal dimension, right? And the non-dialectical notions of truth, he says, are timeless, right? So they're sort of separated from a temporal dynamic, right? So they're always unchanging. So you use the word evolution, and that seems to be sort of part of his argument here about this contradiction in the example of the human. There is a certain dynamic to this conception. It cannot be exhausted by this simple statement of, right?
It can't be exhausted, and it will never be.
It's true, but it's not. It's not a discretely true. It's not permanently true.
And it will never be exhausted.
And you could also think that Adorno's also, maybe speculating on, or this is, beyond what he's actually saying here only, is about the human being to come. That there, has not been that human being that Marx, or the Marxist dream of the whole person or the whole man or the new man or whatever we want to talk about is all. I'm sorry, yeah. What's that?
There can't be.
Yes.
There's always
Yes, there's always going to be
something
something,
that
but that doesn't stop us from trying to get there.
So how is
No,
this
that's the
different
point.
from saying it's necessary but not sufficient?
What's necessary?
Yeah,
Well,
what would be
we
the
use-
necessary?
We use that in logic. We say, well, it's a necessary condition, but it's insufficient. So being a biological human is necessary, but it's insufficient to category of humanity or human.
That refers to causality, which
Yeah.
is different from
Okay.
here. I don't think
There's not a causality work in
Okay.
here. That's
the question of necessary and sufficient is a question of causality.
Okay, I understand.
That's also, of course, in dialectics too. Because dialectics is against the reductionist causality that everything has a single cause.
You can see, you and Arto and Chris, I guess, in some ways, the connections to Heidegger's critique of the disciplines here as well.
It's almost
the same.
The same space that they're operating.
There's a
They're just
German
expressing
guy
it in a
that wrote a
different
book
way.
about this that's very kind of interesting in terms of the
confronting the matter,
Yes,
allowing
right.
the matter to be one with you.
And
so
not
on
only
so
that,
forth.
the biological, what's being taken on here, in terms of the regional ontologies of the regional sciences, and,
It's almost like he has a
and
problem
then-
with Heidegger because of Heidegger's politics. Or,
Well, of course,
That's the end of. That's the end.
Yeah,
of the,
yeah, he has a
which is-
problem with it.
That's exactly what
Which is a problem for Adorno because
Yes.
he should have.
They worked out more on the Heideggerian side. They were working this muscle all the time, the Frankfurt School. The Heideggerian folks were working out both ways.
Yeah.
The ski slopes and the hut, right?
Yeah.
Writing down the hand.
Too much the castle,
right?
The chateau.
You mean Adorno and the Grand Hotel
Maybe a little
Abyss?
bit.
German moralisms.
What's that?
Adorno and his people.
Who's this?
Adorno and the others who weren't immune from the moralisms of the bourgeoisie.
You don't think they were immune from it? I think he wrote Minimum Moralia for that very reason, to get out and get away.
In the letters between Adorno and Benjamin, they made fun of Sommerleffel, who was in Paris.
Oh, they do. Yeah, no, that's true.
He'll be hanging in the cafes, just smoking cigarettes and
Right.
hanging out all day, so they make fun of his lack of work ethic.
Yeah. Well, you don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, what's up with his critique of jazz, too?
Horrible.
He doesn't know.
Horrible. You know, the problem is with, I'm going to tell you about Adorno with jazz. Most of you probably know he's renowned for this vicious critique of jazz, the perennial fashion. And anyway, first of all, he never listened to anybody beyond Glenn Miller or, champagne jazz, if you will. What you could call basically, the blonde, dancing on the floor with a champagne glass and one hand and big band. And big band, he didn't listen to that either in terms of the good stuff. He didn't listen. Paul Whiteman, he probably, but certainly not Benny Goodman or Ellington, he never listened to. But anyway, and I think people tried to get him to listen to Coltrane and Mingus and others, but he refused, in a sense. So his writings on jazz were really about Dixieland and early big band jazz and champagne jazz. So this is where his critique is located. In another way, he's certainly right about Dixieland when you really think about what's the object from which he's drawing his material. He's only studying. He's not making a critique of Mingus or Davis or of Parker or whatever. And bebop he never went to either. This was nothing else. So he in his way talking about the jazz of Dixieland was like the castrated Negro, playing the saxophone, and he goes through all this Freudian symbolism with this. On the other hand, he, to his credit, he was a good friend of Coleman Hawkins when they were in London together, and he wrote several essays against the racism in the jazz clubs, that are published, that have come out. So he had a different relationship to the racial, policies of the clubs, right? Back around his friends with Coleman Hawkins than he did later. I think Hawkins was in London, and I think Hawkins actually had some relationship to music department either at Oxford or at that time, because Adorno was writing his the book on logic. He wrote his book on logic is basically against epistemology. His dialectical logic plays out in a different way vis-a-vis a lot of these things here in a book called Against Epistemology. It was written 20 years before this, but it's it's pretty much of a really a kind of masterpiece, and it's very much against idealist dialectics, which he associated with Husserl's phenomenology, that it produced new idealities instead of getting ultimately to the matter itself, to the things themselves. So anyway, so it's ambiguous related, but he had no desire to learn jazz at all. I mean, if he had known some of these people, I'm sure he would have taken to it. I mean, but very strange related. What's that?
He didn't say why he didn't want to listen.
No, he never. That I've never found. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's something.
Because he writes
out
a
there.
lot of about the Second Viennese School in music. This kind of atonal.
Yes, right. Well, he was taught by Schoenberg.
Yeah.
Actually, it was not one of his better students.
Right, and they told him to quit music. And,
Yes, they did.
Focus in philosophy, but
Yeah.
but the late
Yeah, I
Coltrane,
know it happened. Yeah.
but the late Coltrane music, or whatever's called free jazz, that clearly overcomes and moves beyond Schoenberg's tonality. There's microtonality.
Yeah, I
there's
agree
all
with
kinds
you.
of-
Yeah.
It's
That's
really
a long
the next-
discussion.
It's an intensification.
If you want to talk
of-
dialectics, that's where you really start.
Maybe
in
he
some
was
ways.
stuck in an idea of high art and
In Europe.
low art.
He was in a way, but I mean, it was high art in a lot of ways to people. I mean, yeah. I mean, progressive jazz took hold of Paris. I mean, these people, yeah. All Sartre did when he came to the United States is go to 52nd Street. And he got lost in Brooklyn because he thought everything looked the same. All the brownstones looked the same. It's an example of Sartre's serial thinking. It's kind of a joke that he was thinking serial thinking and seriality in Brooklyn. But there was a lot of high art around it at that time.
No, I meant for Adorno.
For Adorno, no, I know. But I mean, I don't know if that. Yeah, I mean, serious music for Adorno was classical and atonal music.
Well,
he had a category called
labels.
serious music. Yeah. He had a category in his own. What was that?
Mahler, right?
Yeah, Mahler was one of his giants. Yeah, well, who is a giant? Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely.
And he didn't, when he was in New York, did he go to the club?
Yeah, I don't think he went to the clubs. They had a book of women of ill repute, he and Horkheimer, for Paris. Yeah, when they would go to Paris. They had a book of.
But for the years he was here, he didn't go at all.
What's that?
For the years when he was here, he didn't go at all to the jazz.
No, not that I know. I don't think so. No, not
I
at
like
all.
to think about when I read the lectures, students sitting there in a big lecture hall furiously taking notes as he speaks.
Yeah. Well, 68, he was done in. That really hurt him because, he had a problem. I mean, I don't know if you know the story. But Hans-Jürgen Kroll was his best student who basically occupied the institute, and it became a real problem.
He finked him out, didn't he?
He finked him out. He called the police. Yeah. So that was the end. And then 4 months later, there were 3 women in leather jackets, who were braless, who went up to the podium and started trying to kiss him, and then they took off their leather jackets, and
Oh, that's not okay.
Yeah.
Was he married?
Yes, Greta.
He was married and
Yes.
for a long time?
Yes, long time.
So that probably made him really uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's actually, she took notes. I should have brought this. I'll bring it next week. I have a copy of it. They did a little kind of jazz riff. Speaking of jazz, it really reads like an improvisation. They did a manifesto, in which they really called for revolution. He and Horkheimer in the 50s, around this time, maybe about 55, 54. And it was a conversation that they had that she taped and transcribed, the wife. Yeah. And it's out there now. Yeah, I mean it's kind of interesting, to hear them. They're very Leninist. It's very interesting. Their politics are very Leninist.
But for him, 68 was not the moment.
No, for Kojève.
But we can kind of understand why also, if it's
Yeah.
for a Leninist.
Yeah.
This is not the moment.
Nor was it for Stanley. If you read the introduction to critical theory. Stanley, I was going to bring it today, but I had too much. I thought we were going to, I was going to point to a couple of things. But Stanley wrote a great introduction. To me, one of the really extremely intelligent piece by Stanley, written in 1972, is what, pushing at that time, it's 30, he's 42, right? Right before False Promises is...
Well, he's born in 30.
No, 33. 33, he's 39, and he wrote the introduction to Max Horkheimer's critical theory, in which he tells the New Left, now's not the time. Based on Horkheimer's critical theory and Adorno. It's a very, very intelligent essay. Yeah, in a way. Yeah, so Adorno, no, not the time. Kojève, Foucault was vacationing in Tunisia.
Althusser was in the asylum.
No, I think he was
Not the
out.
asylum.
He was trying to give instructions to the CGT and the PCF, but they weren't hearing it. Yeah, but Adorno called Daniel LaRouche, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who became ecology people, that he was a clown. He and Marcuse, had to exchange letters about him. They liked Rudy Dutschke. They thought he was intelligent. Yeah, he didn't live to see the Biker Meinhof train. Marcuse did. Sartre went to see them in jail. Went to see Andreas Biker, and walked out and told the German press they acted in good faith. Right. So it's kind of interesting. And Jürgen Kroll died very early, but a brilliant book on Adorno. He was really, one of the best of his generation. His student, Hans-Jürgen Kroll, K-R-A-H-L. Yeah. Was the student that he called the police on. His best student. Called the police.
Lenin would never do.
No, of course not. Right. He tells Stalin, take care of this your way. Right. Anyway, so, very interesting. Anyway, I was going to say, too, that I thought, obviously there's not time, but Stanley may do this next week with his own, his own, I'd say we'd stick with through 6 through 10.
How about we send an email out?
Yeah, we sent an email out. Yeah, confirming. Yeah, and I think that you really gain a lot, and by reading propositions. I mean, you could read 1 through 20 in the phenomenology would give you a great background to what Adorno's up to here. Ending with the true is the whole, right? Which is on the number 20. But he has stuff on substance and subject. It's a transition from Spinoza to Hegel that's operative here. Formalism and the absolute, the principle of identity, what we were going through today. A is A, the absolute and identity is in this section, right? And this is very interesting, yeah. And most, yeah. So I think this would be a good exercise. I mean, it's difficult, but I think it gives you a sense of where Adorno's coming from.
Whose proposition?
Hegel. The preface. Yeah. The preface is 70. Oh, you're here. 72 propositions. 72 propositions of the preface. Stanley takes 1 year with his students on this. Used to. We read them one by one, Michael. This is all he reads, the phenomenon. But anyway, Hippolyte thought the introduction was more important. Proposition 73 through 80. Yeah. So, actually, the book itself is formed in propositional terms, right? There's, to go back to Aristotle, there's a very Aristotelian formalism at work in Hegel's phenomenology. I mean, at least, textually. You could break that apart and start a different movement.
The logic, the
this isn't the
logic.
Oh, okay. This is the phenomenology I'm speaking of. It's the preface of which.
That's all you need, really.
That's all you need. It's true. Stanley's right about that. I think. Yeah. It ends with the real, the real and the universality of spirit, and how it's gathered strength. So this whole thing of the universal in particular, and I would go, just keep going through 6 through 10 because it was good to go through. It's a great example. And I think if you look at, again, you look at the way he defines things, you're going to get a grasp of how complicated this movement really is, right? And at the same time, because we're not going to put our fingers on it. When a Berthelloman, with all due respect, writes Dialectical Investigations, it's an intervention to a degree, but it doesn't really speak to the complexity of this kind of thinking, and what's going on here. He gives good examples. He teaches by example. Berthelloman in a book called Dialectical Investigations. There's another one, right? There's two books on dialectics. I think he wrote another book.
Yeah.
Another one. No, the Dialectical Imagination is an introduction to the Frankfurt School. The Dance of the Dialectic, maybe it. Yeah. Here's Rhodes, dance here. Yeah. Which is like a
This is a
Hegelian.
Monopoly game on Dialectical.
You mean Class Struggle is the name of the game? And what, Monopoly was the answer to Monopoly.
Monopoly, right? Yeah.
That reminds
It
me
was
of
the
Comrade
anti.
Detective. Do you know that show,
the
Comrade
anti.
Detective?
No.
Oh my God, you gotta watch it.
What is it, Comrade?
I've
Comrade
heard of it.
Is it from London,
I was
England?
told
Oh my
it's
It's
God,
an English
it's
show?
freaking hilarious.
Is it English? Is it English?
Kind of. The premise is that it's subtitled from the Romanian. But that's just the premise.
Oh, it's a Romanian show.
No, it is, but it isn't. That's the premise. It's a
It's an
communist
American
police
show.
detective.
Oh, good.
It's a buddy serial that you would have in the like in the 80s.
What is it on PBS
No,
or
it's
on
on
cable?
Amazon. Sorry, you gotta.
Oh, no,
Jeff
Jeff Bezos ain't gonna get me in over some communist
But no,
detective.
it's,
Yeah, I'll just get
my
it.
son says
It's
it's the
good.
best thing he's ever seen on
Really?
TV. It's freaking
Better
hilarious.
than The Wire?
And they find a Monopoly game in Romania, and that's just
You gotta
crazy.
stream.
Stream, huh? Yeah, I got to figure out a way people can,
Well, you have a laptop, Michael. That's all you need.
That's true.
You don't need anything.
That's
There
true.
really
Everything
is.
you need is already there. Just the credit card. That's
Or Bitcoin.
Well,
Or
It's just
Bitcoin.
Amazon.
What's
You
that?
just need Amazon Prime. That's all.
My cousin got a job with Ethereum is backing a new journalistic enterprise. Peter
Let's buy some
investigated
tokens in
it. Civil, that's how you
What is it called?
participate. Civic.
I'm gonna buy some.
It's decentralized, free journalism. She's going to be one of the players in it. Yeah,
No, it's not free.
it's not free.
No, you have to pay.
No, I said free for the journalists. Free
No, the
speaking
journalists will get
journalists.
paid, isn't it?
Yes,
More than
indeed.
free.
Yes,
They'll-
of course.
they'll get money.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's without any.
No, my cousin's not
The
free.
initial coin offerings, my
Yeah.
ICOs.
No corporate
It's
advertising.
Ethereum is backing this.
Yeah.
5 million they put in.
Ether is the name of the money.
Yes, I know.
A lot of Russians. It's all Russian. Somebody sees.
I'm so
Putin's-
surprised. I was
lot of
so
states-
surprised that Wall Street's mimicking drug dealers, hiding money offshore here. And now they want a piece of it. And all the banks are meeting. We need an apartment for this now. I mean, speaking of the hole in the parts.
You're shocked. Shocked.
Yeah, astonished to learn that, the Russians are involved, huh? Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
That's where the money is.
Trump currency. Yeah, you're waiting. You'll hear
Is the
about it
Pirates
soon.
acting in good faith?
Pirates have good faith.
Yeah.
Yeah, always good faith. Yeah. They're good. Especially the Jewish pirates in Louisiana, the Lafitte's. They were anti-slavery. They were very interesting characters. Jean Lafitte and his brother. Yeah. And they operated in Barataria. They were responsible for winning the War of 1812 in an indirect way, but this is dialectical thinking because they controlled the bayous and they did blockades of the English ships getting in arms to fight in the Battle of Chalmette. So without the pirates in Barataria, which means bargain land in French, Creole language, without that aspect, there's a very, very good chance that Andrew Jackson may have been beaten in the War of
But
1812.
they'd already signed the peace treaty at that point.
No, the battle of not that early.
Oh,
Yeah,
1812.
yeah. Oh no. And then Jackson deported him later. the pirate. And there's a legend out there. I don't think it's been Paul Virillo, the French philosopher, and also he works for the Department of Defense in France, Ministry of Defense, suggested that Lafitte, he actually ended up in Manchester, England. And that he met Engels, and they needed seed capital for the manifesto of the Communist Party. So Lafitte had extra money and gave it to him. He was very favorable towards, this movement, right? It's an interesting story. So Franklin Rosemont, I know all this stuff because Franklin Rosemont, an American surrealist, left a whole dossier when he died on Jean Lafitte, letters and all this stuff. He was doing a book on it. And my friend John Clark is in possession of these manuscripts now. And we're going to try to figure out if if Lafitte actually, we know he went to Manchester. The question is, did he meet Engels there, and did he actually give money? So maybe the manifesto of the Communist Party was funded by a pirate, which would be a great story. Yeah. We can do a Broadway musical and make a lot of money.